how long did you say you were homeless before?
Well, I've been in DC since '05, and I was homeless when I got here, and I just got housed about a week and a half ago.
I know, congratulations. So I'll put maybe a picture right now of the picture you sent me of your keys in your apartment.
Right.
That must have been such an amazing feeling.
Yeah.
Was it amazing? Tell me what that was like.
Well.
Let me give you some quick context. I was filming a homeless encampment for a documentary on homelessness when I met Eric, who was operating a sewage truck cleaning out the camp's porta potty. He asked me what I was up to, and I told him about my mission, whereupon he told me he was actually homeless himself and actively advocated for the homeless. I asked him if he would sit down for an interview with me and share some of what he's learned, to which he agreed. So here it is. Enjoy.
So I arrived in DC in '05. I started advocating for the homeless in '06. I signed up for housing probably around '07, and then
14 years ago, you signed up for housing.
Right, and so then DC government, they have several different housing programs, and someone from Department of Human Services came out to the CCNV shelter probably around 2016 and did what was called a VI SPDAT survey. It's a vulnerability index, service prioritization, determination assessment tool. Crazy long name. But anyway, he did that on me probably about 5 years ago. And then in November 2019, I got the message that my name had come up for housing. So it took about a year and a half to actually finish the process, which is extremely long. It shouldn't take more than a month and a half, maybe 2 months to finish the process. But I don't know why they were so slow in the beginning, because the COVID-19 measures didn't kick in until March of 2020, which is 4 months after I first got contacted. And then in July of 2020, they told me that I made too much money in 2019.
Because were you working for that sewage company then?
So I've been working for this company, Gotta Go Now, since July of 2018. And so they said in 2019, I made $31,000, a whopping $31,000, and that if you make over $26,500, you can't get this housing. Then I said, well.
So it almost would have made more sense for you to make like $25,000 that year.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but because it was 2020, we had COVID-19, and the company I work for, we don't just do porta potties, we do event rentals, tents, tables, chairs, porta potties, things you would use for like a block party or maybe a wedding or any type of outdoor event. And so I fought it, and I said, well, during 2020 with COVID-19, I'm making a lot less money. And so a month later, actually on my mom's birthday in August of 2020, they said, we're going to give you the housing. But if you ever get above this income level, then you're going to lose the voucher. And so then it just took them a long time to get things done. By this time, the COVID-19 measures were in place and people were working less hours and so forth. And so it took them 2 months from the reversal of decision in August to finally get the voucher in my hand in October of 2020. And then I began looking at different places. I wanted to go somewhere nice. I didn't want to go into the rundown hood, if you will. And so I looked around Navy Yard. Well, first I looked.
Now, so let's pause for a second because, okay, a couple things. One, like just for the viewers for context, I think the format I have in my head for this is we're going to be talking about Eric's story personally, maybe a little bit, however much you're comfortable talking about, but then also just because you've been around it so much, like what your thoughts are around the whole situation. But also when they hear you say, well, I wanted a nicer place through this government program, they're going to be like, look at this guy. He's making money and he wants a nice place. Like, he's so entitled. But tell me the story you told me before of
this other couple.
Of this other couple that they got put into housing in a shady neighborhood and what happened to them.
Right. Yeah. So this couple I know, they were staying by the bridge on M Street in Northeast, and It's a white woman and a black man, and I can tell even without being a professional that she's dealing with some type of stress, and I don't know the exact brand, but he might have some intellectual issues himself, and anyway they didn't want to be in a rough, shady type of neighborhood, but their voucher limit was $1,350, and so all they could afford was a place on Benning Road, northeastern DC, in one of the poorer neighborhoods. And the woman told me that she's really uncomfortable being there, that she doesn't really like a lot of the activity that takes place in the neighboring blocks around her residence, but she took it just because it was all they could afford with their voucher limit, and I, on the other hand, got a different type of voucher where the limit is about twice the amount. It's about $2,700, and so I was able to move into a nicer neighborhood where I don't have to really worry about guns being fired or a lot of loud noise. I should say that I'm actually right near Howard University, so I do see a lot of university students, but from what I can tell so far, they're not any trouble, and it's not a dangerous neighborhood.
I thought you had told me someone had got murdered or robbed or something when they had been put into housing.
Oh yes. So there was a woman some years ago. Well, she went by a couple different names, but I know the one I knew her by was Patricia, and she had mental illness, and she also had drug addiction, and she got housed in the Ivy City neighborhood, which is basically the same neighborhood that this couple moved into, and she, because of her drug habit, she would front drugs from the drug dealer. She'd get them on credit, and she wasn't able to pay. And then the drug dealer came in and took over her apartment and began selling drugs from her government apartment. And she began to stay on the street again. And this case manager who worked for the Salvation Army, outreach worker, said to her, "Patricia, you've been housed now, go home." And so finally Patricia took her advice and went home, and she confronted the drug dealer, and the drug dealer shot her in the head and killed her. And so that's what happens when you get housed in a drug neighborhood, especially if you have a drug problem. Even if you don't have a drug problem, you can still get caught in the crossfire, but when you have a drug problem, you're even more likely to be the victim of violence. And I also have a friend named Steve who has a friend named Tommy, and Tommy had lived safely on the streets for over 10 years, and then he got housed in a drug neighborhood, and he had a drug problem, and he too got drugs on credit, and 3 days after he got housed, he was found lying in a pool of blood. He'd been beaten within an inch of his life. He got put on life support, and it took him 6 months just to be able to say his name again. He was beaten so badly. And so that's what happens when you get housed in a rough neighborhood, especially if you have a drug problem. I personally don't have a drug problem, but I decided I wanted to go for the nicer neighborhood, not from a sense of entitlement, but I just want to be able to live comfortably and not be afraid that I have to dodge bullets going in and out of my place. And to be honest with you, the cops, the city should work to clean up the rougher neighborhoods so that even people who live in those neighborhoods don't have to dodge bullets going in and out of the place. So let's.
Well, I thought we had to defund the police. I thought that was.
Well, I don't agree with everything that Black Lives Matter has to say, but what I tell people is this: if you want to defund the police, if you want to abolish the police, you have to first figure out what positive roles the police play, because they do play positive roles, even if you have some bad apples, and some star, maybe Chris Brown or one of these Afro-American stars, had made a statement about how you can't just have a few bad pilots who decide to crash planes in the mountains and that kind of thing. You have to make sure 100% of your pilots are good, and the same applies with cops. And I get that, but for those who want to abolish the police or defund the police, you do have to be rational about it and figure out what positive roles the police play, and then how you're going to have some other agency, some other group fill in and take care of those positive roles that the police play without also fulfilling the negative roles. And I also think that Black Lives Matter should choose their battles wisely. It's always good to choose your battles wisely. And not all of these situations that Black Lives Matter harps about are necessarily good situations to harp about. I thought that they started off with the wrong situation with Michael Brown. People argue that the cop didn't have to shoot him, Darren Wilson didn't have to shoot him, but hey, Michael Brown was 6'4", 300 and some odd pounds. He was a big dude. He was about twice the size of the cop, and rumor has it that he reached into the cruiser window like he was going to grab Darren Wilson, and heck, in that situation, I'd have shot him too. It would have been hard not to. I'll put it like that, and so that was a bad situation to use as the kickoff for Black Lives Matter. And more recently, Ma'Khia Bryant, I'm sorry that she died. I'm sorry that Michael Brown died. But at the same time, when the cops showed up, Ma'Khia Bryant, she may have been the victim. I've heard the backstory that the woman in pink who she was getting ready to stab was actually the original aggressor, and that Ma'Khia Bryant was basically defending herself with the knife. But when the cop showed up, what he saw was a woman with a knife going at another woman. And Ma'Khia, she may have been 16, she may have been in foster care, yada, yada, yada. But she was not a small woman, and she was running at somebody with a knife, and that's all the cops saw. So you got to be reasonable, and so. But if you go by what the cops saw when he arrived, that he did the best he could have possibly done, So.
Well, I don't think the other woman was attacking her with a knife either. So that's.
No, what I heard was the backstory was that this was an ongoing thing, and this wasn't their first encounter. This wasn't their first conflict. That I heard that Ma'Khia Bryant, her foster mother, would call the woman in pink. The woman in pink was actually 28. So she was almost twice Ma'Khia's age, but the woman in pink would get called to deal with Ma'Khia whenever her mother couldn't deal with her. And Ma'Khia was 16, and she was doing what 16-year-olds do, And so Ma'Khia got tired of the constant conflict with the woman in pink, and on this occasion she went at her with a knife, and it cost her life, unfortunately. So there was a lot that could have been done differently. If this was an ongoing day-to-day, week-to-week conflict, the cops should have been called before things got to that level, and then Ma'Khia might not have grabbed the knife. And I heard Ma'Khia might have been the one who called the cops.
Well, that's almost an advocacy for more policing.
What I've pushed for
earlier police intervention.
Right. Yeah. Well, earlier police intervention or earlier conflict resolution among the community. There's that too. And if somebody is bothering me from day to day, and it has happened, where someone bothers me day to day, week to week.
You tell them to stop, and they don't stop, and tensions build up.
And then what I do is I have done this. I've called the cops and I've said, look, this person keeps bothering me day to day, week to week. I put it on record. And the cops basically tell me, okay, we've got a record of this person bothering you. So if they come back and bother you again, do what you have to do, Mr. Sheptock. And I've never had to stab anybody. I've never had to shoot anybody. But just by the person knowing that it's on record with the police, they know that if they attack me, I have a backup story. So if we end up in court, I'm most likely going to prevail, and that assumes they don't kill me, in the conflict, but here I am still here, and that method has worked for me. But when people get riled up and emotional, their reasoning goes out the window, and that's why if you live through the conflict, you should always think rationally, how can I prevent this from happening again? And so if what I heard was the backstory for Ma'Khia Bryant, if that backstory is true, then I would say that a lot of people did wrong. There was a full-on melee taking place. There were like half a dozen people or better fighting at the time, and so they should have resolved the matter before that day.
Sure, but once you pull out a knife, I think it stops being self-defense at that. Once you escalate the situation to something potentially fatal, then you've sort of given up your...
Right, exactly. So I would say we're actually on the same page, but I'm thinking that, the day before Ma'Khia Bryant died, or the week before, whenever the previous time was that the woman in pink approached her, she or other people who knew about the ongoing tensions should have said, look, let's put this on record with the police. But of course, there's that code of silence where you don't want to talk to the police, and then when things do escalate and you do pull a knife and the cop shows up, even though you might have been acting in quote unquote self-defense, what the cop sees is a person with a knife, and he has no time to stop you because you're like within 5 feet of the person and you got the knife raised. So I understand why the cop shot. I don't fault the cop. The ones who I fault are the adults who had prior knowledge of the ongoing conflict and who didn't use conflict resolution skills before that fatal day. That's who I fault. And so there are other instances where I would say that the cop was in the wrong. The cop shot Walter Scott in the back 8 times in South Carolina. The guy was running. He was running because he had child support that he hadn't paid. That's why he was running. And the cop shot him in the back 8 times. Well, that cop, I think his last name was Fager, Michael Fager, if I'm not mistaken. Well, he actually was convicted. I think I'm correct on that. But anyway, so in that instance, the cop was wrong. And there are other places where the cops were wrong. Freddie Gray in Baltimore, the cops were wrong. Okay, but when the cops are right, we got to say that too. Or when the cop just couldn't have done any better. Maybe he shouldn't have shot Ma'Khia Bryant, but given what he saw, there was nothing more he could do in a split second.
Yeah, so I mean, that all sounds very reasonable to me. I'm not aware of those last 2 cases, but it makes sense to call for a rational approach to taking it situation by situation and the context within it, rather than just saying like all cops are damned and just get rid of all of them, completely abolish them. That's basically kind of lazy thinking. Or
exactly.
It's like you're not going to get your point across if you just say it's all just fallen and it all just needs to be wiped away.
Right. And if you do want to wipe it away, you have to replace it with something better. If you don't have something better to present, then don't talk about abolishing the police. And I've said the exact same thing about the GOP not liking Obamacare. I was always taught you don't get rid of what you got till you get something better. You don't like Obamacare. You came out against it in 2009, 2010. I think it was passed in 2010. And then you get a GOP president in 2017. 6.5, 7 years in, and you still don't have a plan to put on his desk. If you hated it that much, you had 7 years before Trump took office to come up with something better, so that when Trump took office, or any GOP president took office, you had something to put on his desk. And just the fact that you spent all those years harping against Obamacare and you had nothing better to present when you finally got your man in the White House, I think what that goes to is that, I guess when I was a kid, we had what I'll call thought rules, like the one I just stated. You don't get rid of what you got till you get something better. Or you go with the best reasoning you've heard until you come up with some better reasoning. Those are some thought rules that have gone out the window, and people are just so totally irrational in terms of how they approach so many different things, whether they're politicians or they're common everyday people, and so and that kind of goes to my advocacy, and how over the years I've advocated primarily for affordable housing and living wage jobs. Those are the 2 things I've harped about the most, and government, they've co-opted the phrase affordable housing. So it used to be that when you talked about affordable housing, you meant that somebody who's working can spend no more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage and afford it, and you have the rest of your income for other stuff, but now government has co-opted the phrase to include housing programs, and that's not exactly what I had in mind when I began talking about affordable housing, so I had to be mindful of the different definitions floating around. But my argument has always been that people who are working should be able to spend 30% of their income and afford a place, and that if someone who's working 40 hours a week can't afford their place out of pocket, then you don't have enough affordable housing. And so there are other advocates who talk a lot about the disabled homeless needing permanent supportive housing and that sort of thing. And I realized early on that there were more than enough of them talking about that. So I said, well, that's not going to be what I focus on. I'll focus on what working people should get, and those who like to give negative critiques of the homeless advocates and the housing advocates, they accuse us of advocating for free stuff. Well, I can't speak for everybody or for all advocates, but I personally have not advocated for free stuff. Never have I advocated for free stuff. I've always advocated for the able-bodied working homeless, like I was until a week and a half ago. I mean, I'm still working, but it's no longer homeless, thank God. and as it turns out, I got put in permanent supportive housing, which is one of the programs for the disabled homeless. So when I got contacted in November of 2019, well, that's a story in and of itself. So, but let me finish one thought first. But I was told that I would be put in permanent supportive housing. And I said, well, I'm not disabled. I'm actually on the job even as we speak. I was talking on the phone from my work truck. The person who told me, a guy named Walden Adams, he said, well, they've changed the criteria for getting into PSH, and they've added the criterion where length of homelessness gets you in. And when they typed length of homelessness into the system, your name came up near the top. That's why you're being contacted for housing. And then he was not going to be my case manager. He was just somebody who knew that my name came up. So he put me in contact with the agency that would do the case management, and I asked that person the same question, and they gave me the same answer. And so I was not housed because of being disabled, even though I'm in the housing program for the disabled. And because of the program that I'm in, that's why I have the higher rent cap that allows me to move into a nice place. But anyway, so in terms of how I was contacted though, so once or twice a month, DHS, Department of Human Services, DC government, they have what are called match meetings, where they talk about people whose name came up for housing that couldn't be contacted, couldn't be found. So apparently they couldn't find me. And I had to laugh when I heard that, because I've been a thorn in their side since June 2006 when I began advocating. And I've had the same cell phone number since around April of 2009. I've had the same email since I started doing emails in November 2006. I lived at the CCMV shelter since December 2008. So my contact info has stayed the same for over 10 years. Everything has been the same for over 10 years. And so anyway, they said they couldn't find me, but this guy named Walden Adams, he was an outreach worker. He was formerly homeless, and so he said, well, I know Eric Sheptock, but I can find him. And so he spoke to another advocate named Reggie Black. Reggie Black spoke to another advocate named Robert Warren. Robert Warren called me and said, your name came up for housing, contact Walden Adams. And so I contacted Walden Adams and began the process. And I explained earlier, how things went with them denying me and then reversing that denial, but anyway, I said that it shouldn't take this long to get somebody housed. It shouldn't take a year and a half. Well, the sad truth is, and I think I sent you a text about it, but Walden Adams was one of 2 homeless advocates who got hit by a car about a month ago and got killed. And so the process took a year and a half, much longer than it should have taken, and he actually died.
Did you know him personally?
I met him personally. I wouldn't say that I knew him well, and because I've advocated for the homeless for 15 years now, he knew a lot about me. So, I mean, I'm a media mouth, but like that, and I've been in front of a lot of cameras, CNN, MSNBC, you name it, Al Jazeera, I've done them all. But and so, when you're on camera a lot of people know who you are, but you don't know who they are, and so he saw me, through the lens of a TV camera a lot, and knew about me and what I do. I barely knew him, and I'd run into him at least a couple of times. While, as a matter of fact, I was servicing the porta potty in Columbia Heights at 14th and Kenyon Northwest one day, and he came riding by on his bike, and he stopped and we spoke, and it was during the time that I was waiting for the housing to come through, and so anyway. Yes, I didn't know him well, but he knew me from a distance.
What exactly happened there with the car running him over? Do you know that story? Or
I don't know all the specifics. I mean, I know he rode bikes because, like I say, he was riding the bike last time I saw him. I don't know if he got hit while on his bike or if he was walking. I did see the article about the event. That's actually how I learned about it. I was actually on Facebook, and I'm scrolling down through my news feed, and I see this article about 2 homeless advocates getting hit and killed by a car. So it didn't say whether they were on foot or riding bikes or what. But it did say that the driver ran, and that the cops caught him, less than an hour later. And so, anyway, that's all I really know. I think the article did mention the intersection, but I don't recall what an intersection it was. Yeah, and so, but yeah, so it was sad, that he got killed in the first place. And I didn't know the other advocate, a woman named Rhonda Whitaker. I feel for her too. But it's sad enough that he got killed and that she got killed. But I guess it's also sad that he didn't get to see this process come to fruition. He didn't actually get to see the picture I sent of me holding up my keys, and so that's kind of a sad spin to the story of him being the one who reached out to me to make sure that I got my housing.
And that seems like such a circuitous or lengthy, sort of cloudy process for how that happened. Do you think it would be much more efficient at this point in 2021? Yes,
and so I would say that, I got put in quarantine on April 30th of 2020. So in the shelter, someone who slept about 10 feet away from me caught COVID-19. And so I got put in quarantine for 14 days. Yeah, and when I went to quarantine, it was just over 5 months after the time that I got contacted about the housing. and so if things had gone well, I would have actually been in housing before I got put in quarantine. Yeah, and I saw an article, I guess about a month ago now, where someone in DC government was saying that it takes about 45 days to get somebody housed from the time that their name comes up. and
14 years after their name comes up, I guess.
Yeah.
In your case.
Yeah, and so
it took a year and a half.
Yeah, actually, so. And so for me, it took 12 times as long. And what I guess what really astounds me about that is that I'm like the biggest big mouth out there, speaking for the homeless, and you would think that the government would say, we got to get this one right because he's a really big mouth, and he'll go on CNN and MSNBC and Al Jazeera talking about, how screwed up our system is if we don't get it right with him, but apparently that didn't happen, and I'm sure part of why it didn't happen is because of the turnover in DC government, of employees. And so there are probably a lot of employees who don't even know about me because my current job, I've had several jobs in DC, but my current job is the only day shift Monday through Friday job that I've had. Other jobs are either weekends or evenings, and so this current job has actually pulled me away from advocacy in a big way. I still do some things, but I don't show up at meetings like I used to, and so there are some people in DC government who probably started in the last 3 years who don't know who I am, and so it doesn't send chills down their spine when my name comes up, that hey, we got to get this guy right, because he's going to tell on us if we don't. And so I'm sure that's part of it, but in any instance, I now have this story of things just not going well, and I'm going to make the most of it. And on top of that, something else horrible happened while I was awaiting the housing. So in February of 2021, a coworker of mine, he got caught stealing from the company, and he and I were truck partners, and so he assumed that I told on him. There were other ways for the company to find out. It turns out that he was stealing porta potties and he was selling them, and the guy he was selling them to lived a block away from the spot where one of our female administrators takes her kids for daycare. and these are bright yellow porta potties, and we do keep them very clean, and we're probably the cleanest company in the area, but anyway, these things can be seen from a half mile away because they're so bright, And so anyway, he got caught, and he assumed that I told on him, and he came out one day while I was leaving for work. I used to ride into work with him, so he knew where I stayed. He knew what time I came out, so forth and so on. He knew a lot about my routine, and so I walk out the door one day, and there he is, and I walk back into the shelter door, and I go out the back, and it was a day that it was snowing and there was ice on the ground. It was February 18th. 3 days after my birthday, actually. And so I go out the back door. I get down to the metro station, and I'm going to ride in to work with someone else. And no sooner had I gotten to the metro station when the boss called and canceled for the day. He didn't want his trucks out there with the ice on the roads and so forth. And so I turned around to go back to the shelter, and this fired coworker, he knew that the boss was probably going to cancel, and so he calls a different coworker, finds out that the boss canceled, returns to the shelter knowing that I'm going to show back up, and when I get back a few minutes after 6, there he is again, and so long story short, we ended up having a physical confrontation. He tried to force me into his car. He did not succeed. That there was a point where he began to prevail on me, and the only thing I could do to keep from getting put into his car was to drop my weight and actually lie down on the ice, but it kept me out of his car. Things could have gotten a lot worse had he gotten me in. He'd probably taken me down to his neighborhood in Southeast, one of the neighborhoods that I didn't really want to move into, and he would have had his boys jump on me, most likely, and so I stayed out of his car, but he did it in front of several cameras, and there's now a court case for attempted kidnapping. And that too happened while I was awaiting the housing. So a lot of stuff went wrong while I was awaiting the housing. And that's part of why I talk about how the government needs to do better at getting people housed. I'm sure there have been people who have died waiting for housing. I mean, I don't know any of them off the top of my head, but I'm sure that it's happened. I mean, after all, it took 14 years for me, and so yeah, the government does need to do a better job. But I will say this too, though, that I might have said this the last time we met, which is that I have anecdotal evidence that DC government is housing people at a faster rate now. I mean, me taking a year and a half from the time that they called me in November of 2019, that's probably the exception and not the rule, because a lot of the homeless are actually not working. Approximately half of the homeless work at least part-time. So there's the half that doesn't. And those who don't work, they get housed at a faster rate than those who do work. And so that said, I have heard a number of people tell me that they got their voucher and that they're in the process of being housed since the COVID-19 measures went into effect just over a year ago. And I'm thinking that the government has finally done a little bit of math and figured out that it's actually more cost effective to house people, because, like I said, I was in quarantine, and I do know that government was paying an average of $180 per day to have somebody in a quarantine hotel. And there are places that go for right around $1,000 a month, and so that breaks down to $33 a day, which is less than 1/5 of the $180 a day to put them in a hotel. So when you compare the price of a hotel to the price of putting them in one of the cheaper housing units, like on Alabama Avenue Southeast, I do know, because of my housing search, that you can get a place for $1,000 a month down there. And so when you compare the two, it's a lot more cost effective to put them in housing. Now, but when the COVID-19 stuff goes away, you won't have that comparison anymore, because you won't have people getting put into the quarantine hotels. But that kind of goes to the next phase of things, which is the government might be housing people at a faster rate because it's cheaper than putting them in the quarantine hotels. But the thing about it is that the quarantine hotels are finite. The quarantine issue is going to go away probably in the next 2 or 3 months as you go back to normal. But the apartment rooms, that's indefinite. Until the person passes. And so even though it's 1/5 the cost, it's going to be 5 or 10 times as long, for however long that person lives. And so they're going to have to foot the housing bill for the next 5, 10, 20 years, depending on how long the person lives after they're getting housed. And so that's pretty much it. I would say that you would hope that the government wouldn't need a quarantine.
So just when it blows.
Yeah. You would hope that the government wouldn't need something like COVID-19 or whatever the next pandemic is before they start doing things properly. But I'll take it for what it's worth.
So I remember you said before that I asked you, since you go around and you clear out these porta potties in the city, that's what your company, that's part of what it does. Yeah. You said they put a porta potty for every 5 homeless, for every 5 tents, I think you said that show up, 5 or more, is that correct?
Yeah, so if there's 5 or more tents in one location, then they'll order for us to put a porta potty there. So when we started doing this, we had maybe 5 or 6 locations where they had us put porta potties. Now we're up to at least 18. And then I've gotten word of other locations where they need to go. So what basically happens is that my fellow advocates, because they know what I do on my paying job now, they'll call me and say, Eric, we need a porta potty here, and then I'll tell them, look, it's up to you when you go to these meetings that I can't go to, obviously, because of my job. When you go to these meetings, you tell the people in DC government where you need the porta potties, and then they'll call my company, and then my office will call me and tell me, put a porta potty out there, and I'll do it. And so that's basically how it works. So I personally have been involved in getting porta potties put at a couple of locations now. One at 25th and 25th in Virginia. One at Northwest.
So my question is, I just saw an article actually from the DCist that said their last count in January 2020 actually showed that homelessness had decreased by 20%. Yet you're saying that you've seen the number of encampments increase by far more than that. That count was in January, and you also said that you think homelessness is going to get much worse because of the eviction moratoriums eventually running out that the government has in place because of COVID. Can you go into that, speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Okay, so you're right in saying that the homeless count does take place every January. And so the COVID-19 measures kicked in March of 2020 in this country. And yes, I have seen the homeless encampments grow. They've grown in number, and then some of the older ones have grown in size. So there's one really massive encampment that at 21st and E Northwest, not far from GW Hospital, and it's also not far from Miriam's Kitchen, which serves the homeless. They have a homeless day program, a homeless feeding program, and that spot is really out of the way, so that it's not in the busiest part of downtown, and it's close to a homeless service center, and so those are two reasons why the homeless go there, because the cops most likely won't come to move them because they're not where all the hustle and bustle is, and so I guess there are a couple of things at work here. There's the increase in homelessness. I don't have any documentation about the increase from March of 2020 until now. There was a homeless count in January of 21. The homeless count results generally come out in mid-May, and it is mid-May right now, so I need to go back online and see if they've published them. But I don't know that it's so much an increase in the number of homeless people. It could be homeless people that have decided to leave the shelters and live on the streets because they don't like some of the structure that exists in shelters, and it's with good reason. Sometimes you get disrespected by the shelter staff, and then there are strict rules. You have to be there at a certain time, and if your schedule, especially if you're trying to work, if your schedule doesn't really allow for you to get there by the check-in time, then you can't get a bed. So there are all kinds of good reasons.
I heard, let me know what you think about this. I heard, I was interviewing another homeless man from, originally he worked for some homeless group or helping the homeless in Portland.
Okay.
And I think he was homeless on the West Coast as well, and then somehow he ended up homeless over here.
Yeah.
And he said that the services on the West Coast were much nicer than they are on the East Coast. He said that, I asked him how the homelessness services were here, and he said people can be really mean, and there's a lot of ex-cons or ex-felons.
Yeah.
Does that map on to what you've experienced, or?
Yes, actually it does. So there are a lot of ex-cons that work as shelter staff, and
it just reminded me of it because you said people getting disrespected by staff.
Yes. So I recall being at the Franklin School Shelter some years ago, and there was an employee there who went by the nickname Toad. I don't know what his real name is, and he was in the habit of talking down to people all the time. And finally,
It gave him a sense of power.
Well, actually, he explained himself to me, so what happened was he talked down to me one too many times, and I told him about himself, and we got into it, and then he called me into the office, and I said to him, you can't talk to me like that. You shouldn't talk to anyone else like that. And he said to me, that he thought that many of the homeless were from the hood and ex-cons and so forth and so on, and that he was dealing with them the way he felt they needed to be dealt with. But he said that with me, he would be more respectful going forward. That he saw that I wasn't an ex-con or a hoodlum type, and so he would respect me as an individual, but he would continue to talk to them the way that he believed they needed to be talked to, and he himself was an ex-con, so he was an ex-con talking to people that he perceived to be ex-cons in the way that he felt they needed to be talked to in that tough hoodlum style, but that's the only person that ever explained himself to me, the only shelter employee who explained himself to me, but that's where he was coming from, basically, and so I guess you could say, the homeless are saying these are ex-cons running the shelters and they don't know how to talk to us, and the shelter staff are saying, well, the homeless are ex-cons and they're not respectful, and so it's a tit for tat sort of thing.
I mean, it makes sense that you don't exactly have like kindergarten teacher types running these homeless shelters. Right. I mean, I can't, would you say it's fair to say it's a pretty rough environment there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a rough environment where people on either side are afraid of the others. It's an us versus them sort of thing, but it's just kind of strange that each one thinks the other is the ex-con who needs to be talked to in a rough way, but I guess it's just weird.
I'm curious, in the 14 years you were homeless, was that in a shelter, or was that partially housed sometimes, or was that in a tent, or?
So I was not really a tent street type person. I've done a few nights living on the streets, but as soon as I had the opportunity, I went into a shelter, and so 99% of my homelessness was done in the shelter.
And give us an idea of what that's like. Is that a bunch of bunk beds, or is that in a big room, or do you each have your own rooms, or what's a homeless shelter like?
So, I mean, the size of the dorm varies from shelter to shelter. You have some shelters where the dorms have 30 or 40 beds in them, and other shelters where the dorms have 10 or 12 beds in them. So the last one I was in, it was 12 beds to a room, and the beds are generally maybe 3 feet apart. You got bunk beds, and so you might get lucky and have dorm mates who are not too loud and who go to sleep early. You might get unlucky and have people who like to play the radio until lights out. The lights go out at 10 p.m. and you're supposed to have your radios off at that time from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. You have some people who like to talk after lights out or play the radios after lights out, and in some instances the staff enforces the no noise from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. In other cases, the staff is not doing their job, and people are talking and playing radios after lights out, and if you're somebody who works, like in my case, I had to get up at 4 a.m. in order to make it to work in time, and so even lights out at 10 p.m. only gives me 6 hours, and oddly, well, coincidentally, I don't really sleep more than 6 hours, and even if I go to bed at 9 p.m., I'll wake up without an alarm at 3 a.m. just because I can't sleep more than 6 hours for some reason, so I'm good with 6 hours. But when people are playing the radios or talking until midnight, I only have 4 hours now, and so when the staff doesn't do their job, then it cuts into my sleep time. Some shelters have work bed sections just for those who go to work, but then you still have some guys who make noise after the lights out, because their job doesn't start till 9, they don't get up till 7, so they're not really worried, and so it is kind of rough. And where I was right before I moved into housing, there was a guy who, I was not in a work bed section, and there was a guy who was dealing with mental illness, who liked to play his music for 12 hours a day. I mean, he would just lie in his bed and play his radio all day long. I mean, literally all day long. And he would not turn it off until 10 p.m. And even then, the staff would sometimes have to come and tell him, it's lights out. Turn your radio off, or put on earphones. And he was dealing with mental illness, and he would get upset, but then he would comply. And I'm lying down just trying to get some rest before 10 p.m., and it was just impossible to do because I could not make him turn it off until 10 p.m. So that much is better now. Now that I moved into housing, and I can go back to my spot at any given moment, and I can have silence when I want it. I don't have to deal with the different personalities or the mental illness or anything else. So that's all good.
Yeah, and just the environment that you're in and the people you're around, I noticed that affects me so strongly that I think if I was in that environment, that would cause me a tremendous amount of stress, which just make it that much more difficult to move forward in life. But I'm curious because a homeless woman that lives near here, actually, in a tent, she said that she tried to stay in a women's homeless shelter. Mm-hmm. And that she found the conditions so poor, and the possibility of someone stealing something was so common there, that she said it wasn't for her, and she much preferred the tent. So I'm curious that you preferred the shelter over the tent. What do you?
Well, my shelter experience is a little bit different than others because of the fact that I'm an advocate, and I actually have heard staff at the shelter say, don't do anything to this guy, Eric. He's got connections in government. Well, I should say that my relationship with government is not really great. Like I said earlier, I've been a thorn in their side, so it's not like they're really fond of me. But
you can stand up for yourself,
yes,
which I guess a lot of homeless people can't. They're not very good at standing up for themselves as you are.
And so I mean, there are people who assume that my relationship with government is better than what it is, but that has kept them at bay more or less, and it caused them to say, I'm not going to wrong this guy Eric because he'll go tell government. And he'll go talk to the media and so forth. And so that alone has made my experience in shelter more comfortable than other people's experience.
What do you think about the growth of tents in DC in general?
Well, that actually completes a thought that I started on a while ago. So I would say that there's the issue of some people leaving shelter and going to the streets like the woman you just described, and then there's also this issue of some people moving because of the porta potty. So when word gets around of where the newest porta potty was placed, and so people who may have already been living on the street, living in a tent, find out that a porta potty was placed 5 blocks away, so they moved their tent 5 blocks. And then there's the issue of increased homelessness, where people are newly homeless, and their first homeless experience is living in a tent as opposed to a shelter, and so you can never really tell whether somebody just moved from a shelter to a tent, or from a tent in one location to a tent in a different location, or if they're altogether new homeless. But yeah, so there's just the fact that an encampment has grown doesn't mean that there's more homeless people. They just could have moved from a different homeless location to that location. And so, like I mentioned 21st and E Northwest. So in that immediate location, there's probably about 50 tents. And then if you go a block east to 20th in E, then there's, last I knew, I haven't been there in a while, but I've heard from my coworkers that 20th in E has got probably 15 tents right there. But anyway, within about a 2 or 3 block radius, you got close to 100 tents. So that's a very dense homeless encampment right there. And for the reasons I stated earlier, that it's not near the hustle and bustle. You don't have to worry about cops moving you. You got the porta potty there. You got the homeless service a couple blocks away. And so I would imagine that it's going to become a problem sooner or later because of the poor trash disposal that surrounds any homeless encampment. But I should also say that the city does do some trash disposal at homeless encampments. My truck, we were driving up to a homeless encampment in Northeast, near, there's 2 that are a block away, 2nd and L, 2nd and M Northeast. And as we went to the first one, the 2nd and L, the road was blocked off. We didn't know exactly why. Then we tried to go to the other encampment at 2nd and M, and the road was blocked off over there. So the city's done encampment cleanups for years, but they've never blocked off the road before. But I guess they figured this is such a big deal here with so many camps that they had to block the road off this time, and so we couldn't get in. So I got
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I got out the truck and I walked down to check it out and see what exactly was going on there. And so it was just an encampment cleaning. And I called a fellow advocate to say, are they stopping people from camping out here? And he said, no, they're just doing a cleanup and the homeless can come back after the cleanup, And so the city does do that from time to time.
What did you mean by they don't have to worry about the police moving their tent earlier?
So there are some instances where they might not realize that they're camping out on private property. I mean, that there are some vacant lots that are not owned by the city, and if it's a vacant lot, and if it is privately owned, if the owner complains, then the homeless can be removed from there immediately. So under the different circumstances, if the city owns the property, then the rule is that the city has to put up a 2-week notice. So they get these big metal signs, just like the speed limit signs, basically. But they have a notice on it, and it says that in 2 weeks, on such and such a date, at 10 a.m., we're going to clean up this property, and if you don't move your stuff, then it will be disposed of. The regulations say that the city cannot start a minute earlier than that, and so
this is purely on private property, correct?
So this is on city property.
City property.
So what the homeless will do is around 8 or 9 a.m. on the posted date, the homeless will pack up their stuff and they'll move out, and the city will come in and they'll sweep and they'll hose the area down and so forth. And then after that, the homeless can come back. And so the cleanup will probably take about an hour or so, and around 11 or 12, the homeless come right back. Now, if it's private property, the city can move your stuff immediately without 2 weeks' notice, but they can only do it if the property owner complains. Now, I have actually heard of these BID personnel. So BID stands for Business Improvement District. There are 8 different BIDs across the city. These BIDs are basically small chambers of commerce, and they each have their turf, and they each represent the businesses in their district, and they go and they advocate to DC government for what businesses want. But anyway, so I know that the BIDs have seen vacant private property have contacted the owner, who actually lives outside of DC, have asked the owner to complain to the city officials. The owner then complains, and the city says, we have to move you right away. And that has happened.
What do you think? Actually, let's take a quick break. I'm going to readjust these cameras because it's raining, and we're back. So back to the question I was asking was, I had a friend who said he thought that the city government should make it completely illegal to have tents on public space in general, that would solve the problem. What do you think about a solution like that?
Well, that really just amounts to moving the homeless around. I mean, it doesn't solve the problem of homelessness. So I would say that any discussion around how to treat the homeless should be led by the fact that we need to create affordable housing, and get people out of homelessness altogether, as opposed to just trying to manage poverty and manage them while they're homeless. But as far as people choosing to live on the streets is concerned, well, they have some very real concerns that cause them not to want to stay in shelter. Some of their concerns are not well founded. I mean, we have homeless people who are afraid of other homeless people being violent, and I tell people that the occurrence of violence in the homeless community is probably about the same as it is for the broader community. I don't think that it's much higher, if higher at all. It might actually even be lower, but oftentimes people will use something such as violence in the homeless community as a reason to want to shut down a shelter, or violence in an encampment as a reason to want to shut down the encampment. But I mean, as sad as violence is, it happens in all walks of life, and it's not specific to the homeless. Just like drug use or heavy drinking or anything like that, those things happen to housed people as well as homeless people. But as far as just wanting to clear out encampments and make it illegal to have them is concerned, well, you're going to have people breaking the law because they just don't want to be in the shelter even while they're homeless, and if you want to encourage people to go into shelter rather than live on the street, then you have to address the concerns they have about shelter. Make sure that they're all clean. Well, that kind of reminds me, like at the CC&V shelter, 2nd and D, the health department used to do bed bug eradication twice a year, and they haven't done that in probably at least 4 years, maybe a little bit longer. And so if there's a bed bug problem in there, then it's because the city is not doing what the city used to do, I, as a working man, I have money, and I would buy bed bug spray and buy other cleaning supplies and take care of my space. But another issue that arises is that the shelter staff will often tell you that people have allergies and you can't use strong cleaners. And you can only spray aerosols between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And if you start work before 8 and you get back from work after 5, then you don't have the right to use an aerosol spray such as a bed bug spray, and so. I mean, it's a tricky thing to try to manage the shelter because of different people having their different issues, including allergies, and it's like, even with me, I love to be clean, and I would mop the floor around my bed with straight Pine Sol, no water, just straight Pine Sol, and because I get up for work at 4 a.m., and we'd have an inspection every Friday, and you had to take all the stuff under your bed, put it on top of your bed, and clean your floor. and inspections at 10 a.m. I'm at work by that time, so I would do this stuff at 4:30 in the morning, and I was told I could not use my pine saw to clean my own floor under my bed and around my bed because the strong smell might wake somebody up. You know, and so there are those types of issues, and I mean, and there is some logic to the rules. You know, not all rules are bad. You know, there are some good rules, but even so, it put me in a tight spot. You know, and so. I get why people oftentimes don't want to be in shelter, and that they have more freedom in the tent cities, you know, and they'll deal with the weather elements rather than deal with the shelter staff. And so I understand that, but if you make it illegal to have tent cities, you're just going to have more lawbreakers.
My friend had a very hard line about it, and he said, fine, then that's, if they don't want to work, then, you know, then I guess they're breaking the law, then they'll, you know, be in prison. Do you think that's too harsh, or?
Well, for those who aren't working, I mean, they have no job to lose by going to jail. I mean, it's no fun.
Or he would also say, you know, they're just lazy. They could get a job if they wanted to. He himself had actually been homeless before, and he said, yeah, I had some issues, and I get if you're like depressed or you're in a rut or you have, you know, this or that issue that's preventing it. But he said, I knew there were plenty of jobs available when I was homeless, and he said he just says that a lot of homeless people don't want to work, and they shouldn't be allowed to just, you know, set up tents around the city. That was his position.
Well, I would say he's connecting issues that logically speaking are not connected. The issue of work and the issue of whether you set your tent up, they're not really connected. I mean, they can be in certain circumstances. If for instance, public transit won't get you to work in time, and then if you set up a tent somewhere near the place where you work, okay, I can see that. But for the most part, where you set your tent up and the work issue are not really connected. And so for him to think that people are setting up tents just because they're lazy, that doesn't even make sense to me. So I would say people set up tents in a place where they can have their peace, basically. So, and that's not related to work. That's just related to when you're off from work, you just want to be in a place where you can have your peace, where you know your neighbors, you know, in the tent city most likely, you know. And in some instances, I find tents that are just by themselves. So there's no other tents around them, just one tent, because that person wanted to just have their peace and not be bothered even by other homeless people. But as far as work is concerned, the stats say that approximately half, or some stats say that in different cities, between 40 and 60% of the homeless work at least part-time. So there's that. But then also, there are homeless people who are denied the job for illogical reasons. I actually saw an article a few years ago about a woman who I believe was in Tupelo, Mississippi. She had become homeless. She was not long-term homeless. She had been homeless for about 3 months. She had been looking for work for the entire 3 months. She got a job offer at KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so she shows up for her first day of work. And it turns out that between the interview and the first day of work, the employer found out she was homeless. She showed up to work, and he turned her around and said, "Don't come back until you have your own place and your own transportation." Well, that was illogical for the manager to say. How could she get her own place and her own transportation without a job? You know, so the employer turned away somebody who he had actually hired, and he turned her away and said, "Don't come back till you have your own place." You know, and there are homeless people who have to go through various struggles to get around that type of employer. For instance, homeless folk have Obama phones, government phones. And last I knew, they gave me 250 minutes per month.
So explain that for someone that has no idea what you're talking about.
So when Obama took office, he did certain things for the homeless and for the poor. And one of the things he did was he began a phone program, because people who are homeless and poor, they have loved ones they need to call. They have emergencies that require they use the phone. And so they got 250 minutes per month given to them by the government automatically. You could get a top-up card and add more than that to your phone. But if you, for some reason, can't afford to buy your own minutes, you had those 250 minutes. So what the homeless did when they were, and still do probably, when looking for employment, is the employer calls the homeless person, not realizing it's an Obama phone, and the homeless person realizes, I have 8 minutes per day to use this phone. And so what the homeless person would do is they'd be innovative, and they would say, I need to call you back from a different phone. And they would hang up, and they would go to somebody like myself that has unlimited minutes because his phone is not an Obama phone, and they would say, can I use your phone? And so they would use my phone to call the employer back and have a full-length conversation. And I, of course, would be sitting there waiting 15, 20 minutes to get my phone back. But be that as it may, I was helping somebody get a job. And then there have also been instances where an employer realizes that 5, 10, 20 people who are applying for jobs all have the same address. And it's like, either this is a really full house or it's a shelter. And he'll look up the address and he'll find out that people applying from that address are applying from a shelter. And he'll decide not to hire anyone from that address. So, we got to be fair. There are homeless folk looking for jobs who can't get a job because of their address, or who have struggles getting a job because they only have 8 minutes a day on the phone, and they have to find someone like myself whose phone they can borrow and things like that, and there are probably employers who figured out that the person who says, let me call from a different number, is hanging up their Obama phone to call from another phone, and when they figure that out, they say, this person's homeless, I don't want to hire them, and so there's more than meets the eye, basically, when it comes to homeless people not getting jobs, and then, of course, there are those who have the deeper issues, such as drug use or heavy drinking, or a poor work history, and so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, if the person is applying for a job, they want a job, so the employer should do what he can to hire that person. And I would say that a homeless person should be able to tell the employer, look, I'm homeless, but I want to work. And the employer should do what he or she can to help that person make it in that job. And there are some employers out there like that, So I did run into one employer who actually said that he had tried to help somebody who was homeless and who had come to him for a job. He said that guy had some issues after getting hired. He didn't tell me what the issues were. I don't know if the issues were, well, he said the guy was living in a tent. He was living in a tent even after he got employed. It takes time to save money and move into housing. And in some instances, even after you get a job, if you make $15 an hour, which is DC's minimum wage, full-time, that's $2,400 a month. The average DC rent is right around $2,400 a month. So obviously you can't afford the average DC rent. So, but anyway, this guy was having struggles even after he got hired, and he was still living in a tent. And this employer said that the issues the guy was having had gotten to a place where he could no longer help the guy. And if you're living in a tent, it's kind of hard to wash your clothes. And even after you wash them, it's hard to keep them wrinkle-free. You got to fold them up and get them inside your tent. And this job, you had to be formal. You had to have on formal dress attire, iron shirt, tie, so forth. And so I would imagine that was part of what the guy couldn't get right. You know, he probably went in wrinkled up a little bit. You know, and so there are some employers who will help people who are homeless, and there are other employers who, when they find out you're homeless, even though you're obviously trying to work, they won't give you the job. They'll even take back the job offer after they've given it to you because they found out you were homeless after they hired you. You know, and so there, like my late father would say, there are two sides to every coin. You know, and yeah, so there are two sides to this issue, and there's wrong happening on both sides of the issue.
What do you think is the public's biggest general misconception about the homeless?
Okay, well, I would say that the public takes, well, simply put, the public does with the homeless what Black Lives Matter and other people do with the cops. They look at the worst of that group, you know, and they label the entire group according to what the worst ones do. This is another one of those thought rules that I referenced earlier. You know, that you can't take the worst of what happens and in a certain group and just paint with broad strokes like the whole group does it. Not all cops are bad. Not all homeless people are lazy. You know, that sort of thing. So anyway, what the public does is they see the maybe 5 or 10% of the homeless who are so bad off, they're so mentally ill that they don't bathe for like months at a time. I've seen homeless people that had on clothes that you can tell they used to be white, but now they're like brown and black, you know, from head to toe. Their hair is disheveled, you know, they're walking around talking to themselves, they're digging through trash cans looking for food. I've actually seen where I'm leading a group of students through the city giving out care packages to the homeless. These care packages have snacks and they have hygiene items. I see a homeless guy digging through a trash can. I say to him, "Sir, we've got some food for you. You want it?" He straightens up, looks at me, says no thanks, and goes back down into the trash can. You know, but 5 or 10% of the homeless are that bad off. They say about 30% of the homeless, give or take, are severely mentally ill. Yeah, and but of that 30%, maybe 1/5 of them are so severely mentally ill that they'll actually not want food that you're handing to them, and they'll prefer to go to the trash can, and they won't bathe for 3 months, even though there are places for the homeless to go take a bath, or a shower, I should say, you know, at these homeless day programs, you know, and then the public sees them and assumes that they represent the entire homeless community. I even had an instance some time ago where I came out of a CVS drugstore. There was a homeless guy who he wasn't, you know, really dirty, you know, mentally ill, that sort of thing, but he was sitting on a crate on the sidewalk begging for change. And he was a black guy, I'm a black guy, and the woman he was speaking to was a black woman, you know, so it wasn't a color thing. But he begs this woman for some change, and she turns to him and in a condescending way says, "Sir, why don't you just get a job and get your own money?" And then she turns to me and says, "These homeless people, I can't stand them always begging for change." And I looked at her and I said, "Ma'am, I'm homeless too." And she stopped for a few seconds. She didn't know what to say. And then she finally says, "Well, I hope you get it together soon." You know, but she talked down on the other guy while speaking to me, thinking that I was housed. I didn't look homeless. But
yeah, and I think the public's, you know, like my only interaction with homeless people before I started documenting all this stuff was just, you know, people asking you for money, or people, you know, you're trying to go about your day and you just feel like you're getting bothered or badgered, you know, and
right.
It's like, just like I'm trying to do my thing, like, you know, like
right.
get away. So that's like their only interaction, you know what I mean?
Right.
Is that.
Right.
So, and it's what other homeless people have told me as well, that basically then just the public just dehumanizes them completely in their mind, and it just becomes like a.
and I've seen instances where, you know, if you're sitting against the wall right here as a homeless person, the person is walking down this way, and they'll walk in a circle around you, so that they don't come within 5 feet of you. And so in one instance, I was near the MLK library, so I'm walking down C Street, and coming from the direction of the Verizon Center, and as I got ready to cross 9th Street, there were 2 women walking in front of me, and they're just about to go past MLK library, and there was a homeless woman who's mentally ill who was sitting outside the library with her back against the wall, and she was shouting at the top of her lungs. And these 2 women were like, "Is it safe to go past her?" And they didn't realize they had a homeless advocate walking right behind them. And I just said, "Keep going. She's not going to touch you. You're all right." And they're like, "Oh, it's okay?" Yeah. And they just kept on walking in their straight path, and didn't try to, you know, avoid her at all, you know, and everything went well, you know. And I've led a lot of groups around to give out stuff to the homeless. And in one instance, you know, I had these middle school kids, and this homeless guy was on a bench, and he just kind of snapped at him, "Leave me alone, don't bother me," you know. And I had advised them before taking him out that, hey, some people just don't want to be bothered, just leave them alone, it's not a big deal, you know. And the guy spoke in what I felt was a disrespectful way, you know, to these small children, but he wasn't dangerous, so I just told him leave him alone, and they kept moving, and he didn't bother him, you know. But I mean, the homeless are like anybody else. They have their bad days too. As a matter of fact, we probably have more bad days than the average person, just because we're homeless, you know. But for the most part, they're not dangerous people, and you won't get any more violence from the homeless than you get from the general public, you know. But the homeless get painted as violent people by people who just don't know any better. As a matter of fact, that goes back to my job. So not my truck, but a different truck from our company. They had a toilet at 9th and Rhode Island Northwest that they were servicing, and the public actually came out against that homeless encampment and wanted the toilet moved and the entire encampment moved because it was right near a school. I think there's Seton Elementary, and I think that they actually won, and the truck that had to move the toilet, you know, they came back and told me that the public spoke out against that encampment and got that encampment moved. And then a few days ago, I was looking for something else, and I actually ran across the article about the public not liking that encampment being there, and in the title it says something to the effect of the homeless being violent, you know. And so yeah, but that is a major misconception. And I mean, even house people, they have their loud arguments in the house, and they have their violent situations right there in the house. And so that's not something that only happens among homeless people. It's just more visible because they're outdoors.
Something I was thinking about was when I was walking around the Tenderloin district in San Francisco. That's where most of the homelessness is in the city.
Okay.
There's people that are almost like in a life or death, almost survival type situation, it seemed to me, or it seemed they were in a very tenuous situation. And it seems like a really hard struggle for them. Like they're almost in hell, it seemed like, for some, especially like the people who are addicted to drugs, and that sort of like that lower percent that you described. And then I walk about a couple blocks away, and I see a bunch of well-off tourists from China with like Gucci bags and stuff, taking pictures of some spot in downtown San Francisco that looked nice, completely unaware of the suffering just, you know, a block or two away. What do you think? For you, it seemed like your quality of life as a homeless person wasn't that bad, or you found a way to make it work. You had to work hard, and you had to come up with a lot of solutions, like you said, trying to fix your bed before you left, and people making noises. What would you say like the quality of life is for homeless people around here?
Well, I've told a lot of people over the years that DC government, they do a poor job of ending homelessness, but they actually do a great job of taking care of the homeless. I mean, despite the fact that certain staff members might be disrespectful, the overall homeless care in the city is actually pretty good. We do have these homeless day programs where people can shower, they can get breakfast, they can get various types of help that they need if they want it. And DC has a certain dynamic that other places in the country don't have when it comes to homelessness. So we're still dealing with what I'll call the spirit of Mitch Snyder. So Mitch Snyder was a homeless advocate who died in 1990, but he and others who worked with him fought for the creation of the CCNV shelter, which I left and moved from there into my housing. But he didn't just fight for that shelter to be created. It was a vacant federal building back in the 80s, and the homeless were squatting in there, and the feds came to get them out, and he organized them, and they fought to have the vacant building turned into a shelter. They went up against the Reagan administration. But there's all kinds of documentation, and films about that. But anyway, but he also fought for what was originally called the McKinney-Vento Homeless Services Act, and that created certain rights and services for the homeless across the country, and that has since been renamed the HEART Act, Homeless Emergency Assistance Rapid Transition to Housing, and it was reauthorized under Obama, so it still exists, and that legislation actually requires that schools have case management to help deal with students who are homeless, and it's got a number of other things in there. But anyway, so there's that. But a lot of homeless nonprofits sprung up during the time that Mitch Snyder was alive, and that he and his co-workers, his fellow advocates, were out there fighting for the homeless. But he also got DC's local government to create a right to housing and a right to shelter. Well, the right to housing got reversed, and the right to shelter replaced it. And the nonprofits that sprung up during that era, some of them still exist, and so DC government, they're aware that these things happened in the 80s, and they're aware that these advocates who began advocating in the 80s are still around, some of them. I mean, they're older now, so in 10 years from now, things might be very different, but for now, while the Mitch Snyder era advocates are still alive, the city has a hard time mistreating the homeless. I would say one of the best nonprofits to come out of that era that still exists is the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. They're at 1200 U Street in Northwest, and there are people working there who were around during Mitch Snyder's time, and they're very good at what they do. Even the ones who weren't around during Mitch Snyder, who have come to work for them in the past 20 or 30 years, even those lawyers are really good at what they do, and the city knows that they're going to have an uphill battle if they try to mistreat the homeless. And so other cities...
What do you mean by mistreat?
So if for instance, well, some of what I know that they fought for, the Legal Clinic for the Homeless has fought for families to be kept together while homeless. Previously, families got separated. The father went to a male-only shelter, male adult shelter. The women and children went to a shelter for women and children, and They fought to keep families together. And some of the other things that they fought for, well, they have fought against. Let me see what else. They fought for hypothermia shelter to make sure that when it's 32 and below, the homeless are guaranteed shelter. And then that number actually got raised. They fought to get it raised up to 40 degrees because even though it might not be literally freezing, you're still cold, and you can actually freeze to death even at 50 degrees if you get wet. But anyway, so. And if they hear about any types of proposed policies that might hurt the homeless, then they'll come out and they'll speak out against that before the policy even gets passed, and implemented.
So it's interesting because another homeless couple I interviewed told me that they had the nicest clothes they'd ever had in their lives, even though they just become homeless about 6 months earlier. Because now that they were homeless, they were getting these clothes donations, and it was actually really nice clothes because we're in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of wealthy people around here, donating very high quality clothes. So in terms of being homeless, they said D.C. is one of the best places in the country to be homeless. And another homeless man told me that people will come to D.C. to be homeless here because the conditions are so much better here. But that sort of gets the question in my mind, it's great that people, it doesn't seem to be as bad in this area as it is in other people, where people are fighting for their lives sometimes. But at what point do you sort of draw the line, and at what point does it become encouraging homelessness, or it's you don't want to encourage it either, but you want to be humanistic and you want people to not have terrible lives, but you don't want to encourage it either. So where do you draw the line on that? What do you think?
Well, I would say that you don't have to decrease the quality of the homeless services in order to discourage people from being homeless. You got to find out why they're not in housing to begin with. And I personally would say that you have to go with the large-scale solutions first. So by that I mean create enough affordable housing, create enough living wage jobs, help people overcome their employment issues. And most of the homeless, those that are not severely mentally ill, if they realize that there is a job available that they can get and that it will pay the rent, most of the homeless would actually go for that. They would go for that job, they would go for that affordable housing, and they would love to have a place that they can afford by working and paying rent. But they don't see where that's possible for them. I mean, like I said, DC's minimum wage, if you make DC's minimum wage $15 an hour, you have enough money to pay rent and nothing else. And so we have to deal with these large-scale issues, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of living wage jobs first, and then I can guarantee you that if you went into any shelter and said to the people there, I can guarantee you that I can get you into a job, and I can guarantee you that that job will pay the rent, that 2/3 of the room would say, hey, I'm in. And they would do everything they had to do in order to get it. And when people are, quote unquote, sitting around looking lazy, a lot of times it's just because they already realize that for one reason or another, they can't get a job because of the biases employers have against homeless people, because they don't have enough pocket money to carry them through to the first check, and things like that, and so they've just kind of given up because of those struggles, and that's something else where DC government does a poor job. They do a poor job of helping you to get through those first 2 or 3 weeks until you get that first check.
How about with this proposed $4 billion combined package plans that the Biden administration has? How about, if we're going to be doing all this infrastructure and fixing our infrastructure, that's great. How about we have some sort of homeless employment program that is included in that. If we're going to be spending, $4 billion or not $4 trillion in this country on infrastructure, right? Like, so when you say there has to be a large scale solution,
right.
Why not on all these infrastructure deals? Why not go around to all the homeless shelters and almost give priority jobs to the people that can't get jobs right now? And then, if they don't show up for work or if they exhibit a lot of problems, then okay, eventually maybe they won't be hired. But if what you're saying is true and that 2/3 would raise their hands, you'd think that would be our first priority, would be to hire those people in these in this massive $4 trillion spending plan.
Right. Yeah. So well, I have to say this well, number one is when I got my current job, I already had some cash. I did other little things to earn money. I worked for 5 years cleaning somebody's house on the weekends, and I've also been a speaker for the National Coalition for the Homeless, and you get paid to speak and to lead groups around town giving out care packages. So I had enough money to carry me through for my first few weeks till I got my first check on this job. But as far as this jobs package is concerned, I would say that I would hope that it would include this idea of job training, because if these jobs you're talking about start tomorrow and someone doesn't have the training, then obviously they can't get the job. But if you factor in 6 months, a year of training before the bridge project begins, then you can prepare the homeless for these jobs. But then that leads into some other long-standing administrative things that I know happen in DC. Like, DC never guarantees you a job, even if you go into a job training program. I can recall 20, 30 years ago, living elsewhere, that you'd see these advertisements for these job programs, and they would say, we guarantee you a job at the end of training. But in DC, that never happens. It's part of DC's culture, if you will, that they don't guarantee you a job at the end of the job training. So it's like, and then in the job training programs that they have, they don't make sure that the jobs you get trained for are jobs that will pay the rent. Some fellow advocates and I a few years ago went through a list of different jobs that were available, well, not jobs themselves, but job training that was available, and we figured out that only about 3 of those jobs would pay the rent, and one of them was truck driver, which means that you wouldn't even be home very much anyway. So there's that, and then DC government never bonds you either. So as far as jobs are concerned, bonding basically is where a responsible party, such as DC government, says, we know this guy is formerly homeless or an ex-con, and things could happen, and he could damage your property on purpose because he has some kind of incident, and we're going to insure you against that if this person doesn't work out, and if they go on the rampage and they break your equipment, we'll cover you. DC government doesn't do that. You probably have to use that with 1% of the people, but even so, they won't do it. And so there's a lot of administrative stuff that just where the government just hasn't gotten it right yet. So if they would bond people, if they would guarantee employment at the end of a job training, then it could work out.
If the wages in DC don't correlate with the cost of rent, and the $15 minimum wage means that you're basically just paying for your rent the whole time, if we're going off the average rent, right, then some people will say, shouldn't people just move to another city or move to another town where it's more affordable? Like, nobody has a right to live in any specific spot. So I couldn't move to Billionaires Row in Manhattan. I don't have a right to live there because I can't afford it, given my job. So, why shouldn't, what do you think about that economic argument?
Okay. Well, so first of all, people have family connections to certain areas, and so they're not going to leave their social circle and move hundreds of miles away. And DC Metro, on the whole, is pretty expensive, so you might have to move at least 50 miles away in order to find something that you can afford. But so there's that, and then there's the fact that people have, in some cases, lived here for 20, 30 years. They might have been born and raised here, and it's only within the past 10 or 15 years that they got priced out of a place, and so you would think that by them being from this area, that they would have some kind of right to it. But then probably the strongest argument, though, I mean, if family connection is not enough of an argument, then there's the fact that no city can possibly function without low-income workers. You're going to need cab drivers. You're going to need construction workers. You wouldn't have a city without construction workers, and you're going to need people working in restaurants. You're going to need people working in hotels. You can't function without those people. And if there's no place within an hour's drive, that they can afford, then and they all move out to where they can afford to live, they're going to have to leave the job they're at, and then you're not going to have enough people to fill all these positions. And if you don't have your hospitality workers, you don't have a tourism industry, So you and. Someone told me a long time ago that had actually happened somewhere. I don't recall where it had happened, where all of the people who worked in the hospitality industry, or a large percentage of them, had to relocate because they just couldn't afford to live there anymore, and the hospitality industry went downhill in that city, wherever it was, But
How do people in DC that are making minimum wage that aren't homeless? How do they make that work then?
Well, they kind of get forced to have two income earners in the same location, whether it's your boyfriend or girlfriend, or same-sex, partner, or you're just roommates, and so you kind of get forced to have roommates in order to make ends meet. Or either that, or you just get a very small space. You might get a room in a rooming house.
Or make income through some other, means, maybe not even legal.
Right, exactly.
Whatever you can do.
Exactly, yeah. And so and that kind of makes me think about how landlords and developers, they actually have more say-so over the lifestyle you have to live than I think they should have. Case in point, there's the Brooklyn affordable housing, I think public housing, over in Northeast. Last I knew, it was being redeveloped, and what they were doing is that they were taking some of these 5 and 6 bedroom units and splitting them, making them 2 and 3 bedroom units. And so the developers and the landlords decided that they only want to accommodate smaller families, and so you have some very large families. In some cases, it's multi-generational, all living in the same unit. If it's a 5 or 6 bedroom unit, and so that's part of how they.
So sorry, camera died there. We were talking about landlords. I'm not sure exactly where it died, but I asked you if you had anything else to say that I hadn't asked you yet, and. I think you gave really good comment or advice for people about homelessness. So just repeat that one more time. Sorry, the camera died, folks.
Okay, no problem. So, I would just reiterate something I said earlier, which is, that the only real difference between a housed person and a homeless person is that the latter has no home, but in the homeless community, you have similar occurrences of violence or drug use or heavy drinking, those aren't homeless problems. Those are human problems. So when you see a homeless person, I would encourage you to engage them in conversation. Don't just judge the entire homeless community based on the guy you see who's really dirty, digging through trash cans looking for food, but rather go volunteer at a homeless service, be it a day program or a shelter, and sit down with the homeless and converse with them, and you'll see a large number of homeless people there, and you'll see that many of them are dressed neatly and carry on good conversations and that sort of thing. Then again, maybe when you're going to work, there's one particular homeless person you pass by a lot, and you give them $1 oftentimes when you see them. Okay, well, that's good in and of itself, but I would also say learn their name, and when you see them again, call them by name, and when you have the opportunity, invite them into a restaurant, sit down with them, and find out their story. And you might find out, number one, that you relate to them, and number two, you might find out how you can help them. But it's all about that human connection and interaction.
Thank you, Eric.
All right.
Thank you.